Welcome to Talking Absolute Worship. Normally we would have 4 people on the panel, but sometimes we get such a concentration of wisdom and experience and knowledge that Zoom simply can't take any more bandwidth, and we have to limit ourselves to 3. Welcome to the panel, and kicking us off, talking about this week's readings and how we might preach with these readings in mind is Neil. Neil, where do you think you're going this week?
Well, it's interesting. The lectionary is giving us some incredibly well-trodden bits. So we've got Psalm 23, which has to be one of the most familiar bits of the Bible, not least for many people who would never go near the Bible. And then we've got the slight weirdness of the way the lectionary takes us to Mark, but then seems to remove all the bits in Mark chapter 6 where anything actually happens. And that's kind of entertaining. So as I was trying to work my way through them, actually I did find that a theme began to emerge. And I wondered if I might go with a theme around abundance. And abundance used in different ways. So part of that, I think, might be the abundance of need. So I think we picked that up various points in the reading. So for example, in the Mark reading, I mean, what Mark gives us, or what the lectionary gives us, is kind of the bits of Mark where Mark is preparing the ground for the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on the water. But they are bracketed by the bits that we're given this time. And I think there what we see is an abundance of need, because what we're given is a sense of there are just people absolutely everywhere. It doesn't matter where Jesus goes. It doesn't matter what time it is. It doesn't matter how exhausted he is. It doesn't matter what the disciples try to do. There are just loads and loads of people. And they're desperate. They want to hear Jesus. They want to be touched by Jesus. They want to be healed. So there is this, it's just a little window into the context in which Jesus is operating. And it's one of just overflowing, an overabundance of need. And that's worth noticing, I guess, because I think we'll be preaching, most of us, into congregations where there'll be people who'll be thinking, well, we know what an abundance of need looks like. I just have to look at the rota on the wall. Mm-hmm. And the rota tells me that it takes about 58 of us to make worship happen. And I seem to be on the rota for everything every Sunday. And, ministers, we may be preaching this in the context of ministries where we've got 2, 3, 4 congregations, maybe more. And the emails never stop. The pastoral demands never stop. So I think that might be a way in to thinking about just what Mark is showing us is that the world that Jesus comes into is a world of abundant need, and people are hungry. And I think that then also resonates perhaps a little because we then in the Ephesians text, we have that a gorgeous bit about the fact that the abundant need there is for previously divided people to discover that they can be one. That the walls that separate us can be overwhelmed. And again, I think it wouldn't be difficult in a congregation to explore some of the walls that divide us, whether that be across generations, thinking of some of the arguments about worship, what can we do, can't we do? Racism, ageism, classism, sexism, all the isms. So there's plenty of abundant need there. And then the Jeremiah and the Psalm, I think, begin to show us what God does. And of course, it's abundant grace and abundant blessing, because both of them give us this sense of you need good shepherds. if you're living in a world where there is so much need, you need good shepherds. You need to know that you are safe and held and cared for and nourished. Um, and that would, I think, it would take me to the Jeremiah, but I think it would also absolutely take me to Psalm 23. Um, I mean, it was interesting. Some of the commentaries I was reading were pointing out that that we're told that, with God, with the shepherd, we will not lack. And the question is, what won't we lack?
Mm.
And it doesn't say. I shall not want. I shall not want what? Well, you shall not want, presumably, any want. So there is something there about just the blessing, and I think that connects to what we see with Jesus, that actually what Jesus then does is he feeds people. And they come with their different needs and they find in him something good and wholesome. And I think it's no surprise perhaps that Psalm 23 is often used at funerals, because if ever there is perhaps a point at which we feel most keenly some of our need, it's maybe at the point when we are most firmly confronted with just how finite and fragile life is. And it's there that we find blessing. And there was a lovely one thing I was reading was reflecting on the fact that this psalm turns through 3 phases. So the first phase is it's talking about God, then it becomes talking to God, and then it becomes again talking about God. And the transition is bang in the middle. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me, and your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And so there's something there perhaps about God's abundance of grace and mercy and love and provision in a congregation that's living in a world where we know how deep our needs are.
Yes, Rachel.
And in the psalm, we also get the abundance of the feast, don't we? The
cup overflowing.
Cup overflowing. And I was just thinking, in a congregation where you've probably got, maybe half your people with their cup half full and the other half with the cup half empty. Why can't we think about an overflowing cup once in a while?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a cracking image, yeah, because we restrict ourselves to those 2 options, don't we? Are you a cup half full or a half empty person? I'm a cup overflowing person. I think that would be we're a cup overflowing church. So that'd be a great sort of like logo image, wouldn't it? An overflowing cup. Yeah, maybe I'm gonna get to work on it. Yeah, Psalm 23. Readers and listeners may be puzzling, thinking that you've heard us talk about Psalm 23 quite recently. Certainly, myself and Rachel were talking about Psalm 23 just a few weeks ago for Easter 4. It appears twice in the lectionary this year, quite close together. And I remember reflecting last time that I had a little bit of a look at that verse. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Neil just kind of reminded me of it now, in that you picked out the middle of the psalm, that the darkness being the place where that transition happens. And I remember us discussing this last time and talking about what that might mean, because it sounds a bit, it doesn't sound great, does it? Enjoying a feast while your enemies have to watch you. It sounds a bit sort of crowing in your victory, doesn't it? And I remember last time trying to find a way around it, but came across an understanding of it that I think helped me put it in its place, and that is that even in that time when I'm surrounded by my enemies, even when I'm sitting in the middle of a Syrian city and the bombs are falling on the outskirts, even while COVID is hitting towns nearby, in the middle of conflict, in the middle of pain and hardship, God still has time to feast with us. and to lay it out. We don't have to say, God doesn't say we'll have a quick snack now and we'll wait till all the trouble's gone. You can feed richly even in the midst of all of this, whilst it's still raging. So it's not a kind of crowing thing. It's an abundance thing and a need thing. Yes, Neil.
Yeah, yeah, and just on that, I mean, one of the commentaries I was reading was also making the point about Bedouin culture, and the background to this could be the Bedouin culture of the Middle East, which is apparently that when you were invited into a Bedouin tent and a meal was laid before you, that was the place of ultimate safety. So even if you had been chased by enemies to that tent, it's kind of like a place of sanctuary. You know, we think of churches sometimes. If I can get to the church door and get inside, I'm safe. Well, in Bedouin culture, apparently, one of the commentaries was telling me, once you were in the tent and at the meal, you could not be attacked. Culturally, everyone had to wait. Now, you know, that begs the question: what happens when the meal is finished and you leave the tent? but
make this
you know,
cup of coffee last a very long time.
You could say the same thing about sanctuary, couldn't you? You know, because of course, what sometimes happens is that people enter sanctuary in churches and stay for years, and so there's maybe something of that. I think you're right that it's not that magically the enemies disappear, but in the midst of the turmoil, there is a safe sanctuary.
Yeah, it's interesting in this Mark passage is that they're looking for that, aren't they? I mean, just to remember where they've been. They've been out on mission, then they've come back and Mark has recounted this hideous tale of John the Baptist being beheaded. They've gone and buried him. It doesn't tell us about that, but it says that they took him off and gave him a good burial. So they've gone through that, and they've gone away to get some rest and recuperation, and they just don't get it. I think most preachers, Christians, would want this passage to go, and then they found a quiet space and Jesus helped them rest and relax. But the truth of this passage is they didn't find that rest space. So the meal and the sanctuary don't always look like we anticipate they might do when we talk about, I'm going away for a quiet day, or I'm going to have some me time, or I'm going to do some self-care. You kind of hope that's where Mark's going, but it's not. He says, nah, but they wanted to do that, but they didn't. It didn't happen because the need was too great. Yeah, sorry, Rachel.
Well, it sort of links, I suppose, to what you just said. Thinking back to what you said about, you know, not just a quick snack because it's all too, you know, too much going on kind of thing. It occurs to me that the times that personally that I've felt I've grown most have been in those really difficult times in life. So when things are just jogging along quite nicely, I don't feel that I do a lot of growing. And I might have, you know, all this marvelous kind of feast all around me, and I take no notice of it when everything's going quite nicely. It's in those times when I feel like I'm in the valley of the shadow of death that I'm so much more aware. And sometimes you don't notice necessarily at the time, but you do when you look back. But you kind of are fed in ways that are just not possible when things are just, you know, they're okay.
A cup of espresso after 3 Zoom meetings in a row tastes way better than one when you've not been busy. Somehow you're sort of gagging for it. I initially thought there wasn't really that much, as Neil said. This appears to be giving us the brackety bits, but the brackety bits appear to have quite a lot in them, don't they? So Rachel, which direction were you headed?
Well, like Neil, I was looking for a theme, and shepherds and sheep popped up a lot, but I didn't want them to be my theme. So I ignored the obvious. But the word that came to mind was community, and us. So in Jeremiah, after our conversation about last week's readings, one of the questions that's top of my mind is, who are we identifying with when we read that? Do we feel like a sheep, or are we one of these bad shepherds? It'd be interesting to see who we feel drawn to instinctively. But in Jeremiah, you've got the idea of God gathering back in the flock. There's no one left out, and there will be fruitful. The flock is taken into, so perhaps that feeds into the abundance. The flock is led into fruitfulness. Lambs will be born, that they will prosper. So I would link Jeremiah with Ephesians, that builds on the idea of gathering in and no one being left out. And that it's Jesus who is the one who does the gathering in and the breaking down barriers, the reconciliation, the peace. I like the idea that together we're being made into a holy temple, and I like the kind of, it feels a bit ongoing, that it talks about grows into. It's not all complete. In a sense, it is also done, but it's also still being done. And there's probably a Greek tense for that, I'm sure, but Greek was a long time ago. I read one commentary that said that Ephesians chapter 1 is about the vertical, but this Ephesians chapter 2 is about the horizontal. So in Ephesians chapter 1, and Phil mentioned when we talked about last week, that us comes throughout that whole of chapter 1. And it's all about the blessings that we've had from God and our response in thankfulness back to God. So you've got the kind of, the vertical going on there. But chapter 2 is talking about how this plays out among us as people. So about the community of faith. And we're good at us and them thinking, I think, most of the time. We're very good at thinking about us and others as something different. What about if everyone was one of us? What does that mean? Who do we want to put in the them group? What if we expanded our vision and could imagine everyone as being all in one community, that's God's community? And because it's Jesus's action, there's nothing that we've done, so we can't say, well, we've been really good at this. Well, we've really earned this place in the us group. You deserve to stay out there because you've not done this and this. You can't do any of that kind of distinction drawing, because it's all about Jesus's gracious activity. And there's quite a radical change between the old and the new life. You've got new identity, new alignments, new loyalties, a new way of being in the world, new way of power operating in the world, a new way of voting, perhaps, new way of spending money, a new way of doing whatever it is we do when we think no one's watching us. A whole newness about life that permeates beyond what's visible. So we've got this new community that's being gathered in, but it's also old because it's built on what went before. It's built on the apostles and the prophets we read. So for me, there's also something about, don't put the past behind you and for the future take us, or however the song goes. Don't put the past behind you, but remember what and where you've come from, where you've been, and use it as a reason for praise and thanksgiving, and then ongoing service, so continuing that horizontal spread. So they were my thoughts about Ephesians mostly, but also Jeremiah.
Yeah, I think the we and you language of Ephesians that Paul uses here is quite a fertile territory for different. You could go in different directions with that. I quite like the one of the longer, occasionally use it, but it's too long for my normal use. YrB prayer of thanksgiving at the communion service, which has this great long bit talking about salvation history, but uses the word we. We were in exile. We were, and associates we with everything that happened to the people of Israel. And I just think that's really interesting language to use, because in this letter, that we, as in the three of us in this room, and anyone who is not circumcised member of the people of Israel, is them. We're not the we here. We're the them. And we get so accustomed to being the we, and then we think, oh, who will we class as them? But actually, in this letter, we're the them. Paul is the we. We the Jews, and you the Gentiles. We're the outsiders who have been allowed in, and it's desperately easy to lose sight of that and become the we. And of course, we want everyone to become the we. But we assume, well, because we're the we, then we can decide who the them are and which the thems are that are. Because I think there's a danger in passages like this in just saying, well, okay, so then it was Jews and Gentiles, so what is it now? And then we substitute a different division and say, right, well, we're we and that's them, and then all of a sudden, it can get just a bit lost, I think, just exactly what's going on in this passage. And so I think I'd be cautious about trying to find an equivalent to Jews and Gentiles. There are so many, as Neil, suggested at the beginning. The options for who the we and them are a legion. Yeah, Rachel.
I think it's also interesting to explore the question of what does it mean to belong? Because what it means to belong to, I don't know, the cricket club means something quite different to what it means to belong to the Labour Party, which means something different to what it means to belong to Christ. And or belonging to a family, or, I don't know, belonging to a book club. We belong to all sorts of things, but what's different about our belonging in Christ? And I think a big part of that for me has got to be that we're belonging for the benefit of those who may not yet feel that they belong. In the other groups, you may be much more inward focused on your interest or the thing that holds you in that group. Maybe you are passionate about cricket and want to go out there and get more members, but I think the outward focus should be quite important in our belonging in Christ.
Neil.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because as you were talking, I was just rereading how our text begins, and it is so powerful when you think of who we are. Remember that you were at that time without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. I mean, it's the scale of that sense of who we were. And I wonder if this is a text and a Sunday that kind of also begs all sorts of interesting questions about reflecting on how the church shares that message into its community and into the world. And what evangelism is one of those words. Some of our congregations don't understand why we don't talk about it all the time, and others of our congregations find it one of the most frightening words you can. It seems to divide us. I mean, interestingly, the very how we handle evangelism seems to be one of the things that now divides the church. And we even talk about, evangelical Christianity and liberal and blah, blah, blah. And just allowing that bit of the opening of Ephesians to kind of lay down for us the sheer scale of what Paul is seeing happening. That because it also is about I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? It's about joining in with the covenants to Israel. So it's about, as you were saying, Phil, that sense that, you know, in the Eucharistic prayer, you can say, "We were in exile." So it might be that somewhere within the sermon or the worship, that here is a Sunday that begs lots of interesting possibilities about how am I and how are we sharing this message with a world which Paul is saying, you know, has so much need for this good news, and we are only listening to it because we have heard it.
I think it's a perpetual struggle in my own head. I think the New Testament presenting the gospel as a very cliff edge thing, and you've picked it out of Ephesians quite well there, Neil. Just, you know, this is a black and white cliff edge situation. You were dead and now you're alive. You had nothing and now you have everything. You were lost and now you're found. It's very cliff edge stuff, and I think many of us were brought up through an age where that kind of cliff edge evangelism was rife. And the point or the technique of evangelism was to persuade somebody that they were lost, and persuade someone that their life was hopeless and that they were dead, and then present them with the answer. But in reality, they didn't actually feel that. Certainly not in the UK. People say, "Well, I'm fine, mate." You know, and you kind of think Christians giving their testimony back in those days would often describe their pre-Christian days as being terrible, years of trauma and everything. You think, actually, no, I remember you from those days. You were quite happy and content. And but how to get across the drama and the total change of the gospel without it being a sort of false a false contrast that you're trying to bring into people's lives that suggests your life is utterly nonsense and mine is ace, and all you need to do is cross this line and you're in. And I kind of wrestle, and that I think that's a challenge for some flavors of Christianity in their evangelism, to work out how you say the sorts of things that Paul is saying to a world that simply doesn't feel lost and doesn't feel dead and doesn't feel empty at all. And you have to persuade them that they are. And then you think, well, are they? They look like they're enjoying life more than I am. To be fair. Sorry, Rachel.
I was kind of going to say the same thing. I've kind of heard enough sort of cringy evangelistic addresses that have, you know, done this whole, you know, your life is empty, but you know, and you don't know it. That just sounds so arrogant. I've got the answer, you know, to all the empty holes in your life, and I always think, you know, I don't think people necessarily feel that they've got these empty holes. And the other sort of thing is that sometimes, you know, we talk about kind of friendship evangelism and making relationships, but sometimes you can look like you're only making a friend because you want this in response. And that kind of black and whiteness is not helpful, but it's a problem, isn't it? It is a problem.
Yeah, well, it's there in the pesky old gospel. Neil.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it, isn't it? It's there would be some people for whom the conversation we're having would just be a non-conversation, because they would just say, you know, where you are making a problem that isn't there, because but you're, you know, I feel it too, that this sense that I kind of know what cringy, scary evangelism looks like, and it's that interesting thing, isn't it? I know from within my own family people who have done the Alpha course, who have had, you know, by week 3, life-changing conversion experiences. And interestingly, during lockdown, I remember reading something about, you know, Nicky Gumbel and Alpha saying we were very dubious about putting Alpha online because we thought it was all about the personal contact and the meal. and we put it online, and it is taken off, and we've had people sitting at home watching their screen, in the classic Wesleyan comment, their hearts were strangely warm.
Mm-hmm.
So there is, in a way, I quite like the fact that this is a text that's making me and maybe the two of you feel slightly uncomfortable, because I kind of think that that's probably important, because it's back to the us and them, isn't it? Because there's a danger that I become very comfortable, and maybe our congregations, maybe part of the danger is we become very comfortable with our theology and our way of being church, and that makes us into the we. And here's a text that maybe, and maybe it goes back also to that bracketing that's going on in Mark. All these people are coming hungry for something, and rather than Jesus saying, "Oh, for goodness sake, let's just get in a boat." Well, he does, doesn't he? Let's get in a boat, let's get away. Oh, good, they followed us round, and now they're still here. And in the end, maybe one of the challenges that I can only speak for myself, that maybe me with my theology needs to hear, is the challenge that says, but how are you with integrity as a Christian and as a congregation, inviting people who haven't yet encountered Christ to encounter him? And that, that may well, I suspect for me, not be about running an alpha course. But that begs the question, if not that, then what?
I think I think that is exactly the question, and I think fumbling my way towards an answer is that the answer that I have been dissatisfied with, I think I've been dissatisfied with because it's a kind of a doctrinal answer. The cliff edge is a doctrinal cliff edge. It's your relationship with God is broken and you need to fix it by doing this. And that's all doctrinal. Whereas I think the thing I would be groping for would be that the Christian community demonstrates a way of living that is radically different. Yeah. But actually that's far more challenging than the doctrinal thing. And you really do have to be a person of integrity, which, let's face it, that's the whole point of being Christians, of what the Christ-like life is that it is a life that is distinctive because of its integrity and the way it's lived. Yeah. And the challenge is that my life is not that different. so I think that is the challenge around relationship building. Then hopefully that that becomes apparent when people get to know us through relationship. They say, "Blimey, these people have got something. There's something different about these people." Whereas actually the reality is these people are pretty much the same as us. And so what's the point? What are they bringing to the table? Anyway, we're still riffing on Neil's marvelous introduction. I better pause. Rachel, was there a direction you were going with? That's one we haven't already started to cover.
No, we covered mine.
All right, cool. Or did I already ask you and I forgot?
You did, yeah.
All right, cool. We did that.
You can edit that bit out.
And it was brilliant, Phil, as you recall.
It was. I must have commented on it. Yes. I was interested by this Jeremiah passage. As occasionally I try and remind myself of what's going on in the Old Testament, because it's not just words, is it? There's like, there are events going on. Last week we had Amos, and we were talking really about the imminent destruction of the Northern Kingdom. And this is sort of many years later, and it's Judah's turn. This is when Jeremiah is preaching. And there's a couple of commentators have remarked about this shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture. The shepherds is referring to the kings of Judah, a long succession of bad kings. And there may be a suggestion here that the exile's already begun, because it wasn't just a one-off occasion. There were kind of two bits to the exile, weren't there, in 598, 587. And this is maybe suggesting that the first bit's already happened and the people have already been to some extent scattered, and they're going to be scattered again. But I kind of often find myself, as Rachel said, I'm going to leave aside Psalm 23 and all the shepherdy sheep stuff, because I think the shepherdy image here is really difficult to get a hold of, because in Jeremiah, it's talking about a theocracy. And that is a very, very different world to ours. And if we make a simple equivalent between shepherd and minister, then we're not really talking about what Jeremiah is talking about, because Jeremiah is talking about the king. But the king isn't what we're talking about when we're talking about the queen, because the queen isn't the same as Jeroboam or any of those kings of the northern kingdom or Judah. So it's very, very difficult, I think, to identify a similar role to the one that Jeremiah is talking about, to these kings that have led the nation astray, or even to get to the bottom of, I think, what Neil was hinting at, as to what he was referring to as sheep, that the idea of belonging, because I think the idea of belonging to the people of Israel was very different to any idea of nationhood or religious belonging that we have today. We don't see ourselves in that way. I'm currently watching something on Netflix called Stiesel, which is just a really fascinating series about a family of Orthodox Jews living in and around Jerusalem, and pretty much nothing happens. There's no murders or anything. It's just, and it's going on. It goes on week after week, just observing this family, and it's fascinating that the way they see this us and them thing, how do we identify as this family, is by rigidly sticking to all of these customs and practices that we've got. And just because they do it in the course of their everyday life, they go into a room and they touch the lintel, and before they drink a glass, they'll say these words, and it's not done to draw attention to it. They just do it, and it's kind of fascinating to watch that and say, well, this does look very much like them and us now. If you were to, and what is Paul describing when he's talking about all of us together as one big family? And we struggle to understand what it means to belong. In order to belong, do we need to be more distinctive, more like each other, more, have a USP that identifies us to the world? Because we don't have that as UK Christians. Anything that kind of identifies us to the world, whereas an Orthodox Jew walking down the street in Jerusalem is identifiable immediately. And I just found the whole thing has been a sort of fascinating bird's eye view, really, of how a religious community is wrestling with these same questions, but in a totally different way than I am. And yet Paul is saying we're one family. It doesn't feel like it watching it, that we're one family. And they certainly don't see it that way either. Anyone who's a Gentile is, it really is beyond the pale. Not marriage prospect, not someone you should be mixing with. And I just think it's a fascinating insight. So yes, Mark. There's an interesting word in there, in the middle. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and he had compassion on them. It's a bit like Jesus looking down over Jerusalem, isn't it? And weeping and wanting to gather them under his wings like a mother hen. But one of the commentators I read pointed it out. He said, yes, Jesus had compassion on them. And then we think, oh, what happens next? The feeding of the 5,000. He had compassion on them. So he did an act of sort of social care. He fed them. And compassion drives our social care program. But actually, that's not what this leads to. He had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. That's the phrase from Jeremiah. And he began to teach them. The response to having compassion on people is to teach them, which I thought was just a really interesting thing. We tend to think of compassion driving our social programs. Whereas here, it seems to be that compassion drives Jesus's teaching program. We wouldn't normally say I'm preaching to this congregation out of compassion, or I'm leading this Bible study out of compassion, but we would say I'm doing the food bank out of compassion. And I thought that was just an interesting thing to point out. I'm not sure where I go with it, but as preachers, we can say we're acting from compassion in teaching people. That's what Jesus did. That was his response in looking out across these people. Yeah, Neil.
Well, and it's interesting because that same, I mean, I think you're onto something there, because it says also in that same sentence, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So there's a nice line, isn't there, between what makes Jesus feel compassionate towards them. They're lost. They're looking, they're searching around for whatever it is that shepherds give, and I guess it's all those things about security and safety and knowledge, and understanding. And then he teaches them. And yeah, we get in Jeremiah, we get that sense of, what's wrong with all of these kings and prophets is that they have been false shepherds. They have been teachers who have done bad things. And of course, that also makes me then think in terms of examples, well, recently and not so recently, of false shepherds in the life of the church, and how catastrophic it is when someone in a position of shepherd, not just ministers, but leaders in all sorts of shapes and forms, and not just in the church. I mean, thinking politically or thinking in organizations, when there are people who have a role and a responsibility to help lead and guide and to help other people flourish, which doesn't have to be about the arrogant kind of I've got all the answers and you haven't got any. It could be a much better thing about, just creating a climate in which everyone can flourish. We kind of know now what it looks like when that doesn't happen, and when shepherds come along, as indeed Jeremiah is railing against, who in all sorts of ways twist that relationship. And I guess, again, part of what we're getting in the gospel and in all of these readings to some extent is the sense of, where do you go to find a really reliable, safe, good shepherd? And wouldn't it be wonderful to be preaching a sermon that wasn't about, so the good news is it's us. The good news is it's our church, because
join the URC.
We've got it right.
The Methodists.
The URC and the Methodists are your true shepherds, because of course we know as soon as we say that it's a heresy, in the sense that we know that we are just as fragile and broken and ambiguous as anyone else. So where do you go? So it's about, you get back to God.
Yeah, well, the whole language is difficult, because the shepherd is like this theocratic king, but then Jesus says, "I am the shepherd."
Yeah, exactly.
And if I'm claiming, I said, "Well, no, I'm the shepherd." No, Jesus is the shepherd. But then he says, "I will raise up other shepherds." But he's talking about David, presumably? No, he's not, because this is post David, isn't it? So who's he talking about? He's talking about Jesus. Who knows? Who Jeremiah is talking about, or is he talking about Neil? We just don't know. Interestingly, this passage, "I will raise up a righteous branch," which the righteous branch is also mentioned in Isaiah, isn't it? The phrase, I think it's Isaiah 11, the righteous branch, is the inspiration for the Branch Davidians. Or was the inspiration for the Branch Davidians, who broke off from the Seventh-day Adventists. And the leader of the Branch Davidians, Benjamin Roden, called himself the Branch. He was the branch. And of course, we all know what happened with the Branch Davidians when it moved through different leaders and ended up with David Koresh in the 1990s at Waco and hundreds of people were killed in gunfire and eventually a huge conflagration. So shepherds and wrong branches, or picking the wrong branch, is a disaster. We know that, and that comes kind of directly from this passage, which is a responsibility, isn't it? I just I just think the shepherdy stuff is just really difficult to. It's so slippery. To be calling yourself the shepherd, but then in the next breath saying Jesus is the good shepherd, and then having the psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, and you think, well, who's the shepherd then? Well, these are false shepherds, and even Jeremiah gets it all mixed up, doesn't he? Really, because the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture, because they've driven away my flock, are condemned. But then I myself, this is God speaking, will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the lands where I have driven them. And so God has driven them there, which is just what the bad shepherds have just been accused of doing. And that's because of their theology, trying to understand if something happens, then God must have done it. And but then it sounds like they're describing God as a bad shepherd, having driven his people, in punishment away. And it's a tangled web when you get into this shepherd stuff. Avoid at all costs, is my advice. But but then or also refer to the answer previously given at Easter 4, when I'm sure we dealt with it much better. It's still on our website and still available in our podcasts to go and listen to Easter 4, where we also dealt with Psalm 23 and shepherdy imagery. So there's preaching sorted, or at least maybe some half-baked ideas offered that you could then take and embroider and bring alive with the experience that you have and with the context that you're preaching into. But there's other stuff that we can do in a service of worship. So Neil's going to dazzle us with some creativity. But
well, since you've just railed against shepherds,
you've got a whole list of shepherds.
I'm going to do shepherds. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to take you to here. Can you see that?
Yes.
So we are under the streets and fields of ancient Rome in the catacombs. And the catacombs were, there's something like 20,000 skeletons down in the catacombs. So they were a place of burial for a very long time, not just Christian, Jewish cemeteries and all sorts. So lots of people were buried there. But before we get to about 400 AD, the catacombs became a significant place for Christians to worship in and to bury their dead. And this is one of the catacombs. And so the little image on the right there actually shows you some of the skulls piled up in the little niche where they were buried. But what the bigger picture shows is what you get on the roof of this particular catacomb, which I think is the catacomb of Marcellinus. I think they all have different names. But what's interesting is in the middle there, you have, guess what? You have a picture of a shepherd. So obviously this is not one for Phil to use because he doesn't like that image anymore. But if you wanted to, it is interesting that more than any other image of Jesus in the catacombs, he is painted over 100 times as the Good Shepherd. And so there he is standing in the middle. He's wearing a Roman toga because he's been painted by Roman Christians. So this is also one of the earliest examples we have of Christian art. And Jesus is no longer a Jew. He's a young Roman shepherd. And he's got sheep at his feet, and he's got a lamb on his shoulders. And away we go. And I think, the danger is I could just be showing this in worship as, here's a nice picture of an ancient shepherd because we've got passages that talk about shepherds. I think there is something more edgy going on. This is the catacombs are a place where people are burying their dead. And one of the reasons that they are burying their dead at various points in the history is because they are being persecuted for being Christians. And they are in fear. And they know that living out their faith is quite literally a matter of life and death. And in that context, to find themselves, what's interesting is they very, very seldom paint crucifixions.
Mm.
You know, we are so used to the classic Renaissance, you know, crucifixion. They paint the Good Shepherd.
Mm.
You know, when life is at its, and I would want in worship to perhaps, this might be a Sunday, for example, to say, let's think about all the people we've lost, all the people who have died. I went to one service, very moving service, where we were given time just to think about that. And then we were invited to write their names down, just to write down the names of people we loved and lost. And then in that context, we read Psalm 23. And I could imagine this being a centerpiece of maybe a station of a cross, or, you know, a prayer station, where we just gave ourselves permission to think, okay, beyond the kind of pastoral, all the difficulties of the pastoral image, what does it mean to find ourselves in a place where life is so precarious, so difficult, so scary, that the idea of God being the one who comes, because what's interesting is what the painter is doing is saying, the Good Shepherd has walked into the place where we bury our dead. And I think that could become, with all the caveats that we've rightly said, that could become quite a healing thing to do in an act of worship. And it might become one of those things where I'd be wanting to print this, you know, it's, if you Google it in the right way, you will get copyright-free images that you can use legally. Mm-hmm. And I would perhaps send them off to one of these wonderful companies who will make postcards or even just business cards, and have enough for everyone to take home and put on their fridge, and maybe a bit of the text of one of these passages, and maybe not, you know, just to key into some of what we've talked about, maybe don't use Psalm 23. Maybe use a bit of the Mark text that just gives us this sense. Maybe that bit that you pulled out, Phil, you know, Jesus has compassion on them and begins to teach them.
I think that would be very powerful. Yeah. On Jesus' left and right there, that's presumably Jonah and the whale.
Yeah. So the other fascinating thing about this is, I mean, you could get me started, of course, and I would head off into the art, which is always risky. But it's, yes, so he's surrounded by Jonah and the whale. So you've got on the, we've lost one of them. So one on the left is Jonah being dropped over the side. The one on the right is Jonah being spat out by the sea monster. The one on the bottom is Jonah reclining underneath the vine that God made to grow to protect him from the sun. And we think it's there because of that text where Jesus says, just as Jonah was 3 days in the belly of the fish, so I will be 3 days dead and then I will come back. And so you've got the Good Shepherd, and you've got the teaching of the resurrection, and you've got an Old Testament passage, all going on above your head.
Wow. And the skull's literally looking at it.
Exactly.
That's very cool, Neil. That's very cool. I can see that being really powerful, and also very pastoral. So thank you for that. Rachel, what have you dug out of your closet?
Well, I was really struck by Neil's thing there, so I'm going to sound quite trivial now. Because I did like going back to last week and the whole spirograph thing that was going on. I think there's room for a spirograph again this week, because just thinking about how the different loops all kind of, are part of the one pattern, could maybe help us to think about community. Maybe do something with those while you're thinking about who do we think of as not us, not like us. How can we broaden our ideas of who we are, particularly in Christ? I thought as well, going to the end of Ephesians, where it talks about kind of being built with Jesus as the cornerstone and growing into a structure. I thought we could build a cairn with little stones. I did think we could build a brick wall, but that's too uniform and rigid for my liking. I like the idea that in a cairn, you can kind of pile on and then it might all move around and disrupt a bit, but it's still the thing, isn't it? And you can still add to it, and it's kind of evolving. It's not like a brick wall that's very much, I'm complete. So I thought maybe we could do something with a cairn. I thought we could sing let us build a house where love can dwell, where the chorus goes, all are welcome in this place. And then I was reminded of something in a book called We Make the Road by Walking.
Oh yes, yeah.
By Brian McLaren. And he's talking about the kind of early Christian community as being an uprising of fellowship. He talks in kind of, sort of revolutionary and countercultural terms. So this is an uprising. It's a kind of, underground movement. But and he's talking about fellowship, but I thought it could apply. That there's a lot more to it, but just the final part, he says, so fellowship is for scarred people and for scared people and for people who want to believe but aren't sure what or how to believe. When we come together just as we are, we begin to rise again, to believe again, to hope again, to live again. Through fellowship, a little locked room becomes the biggest space in the world. In that space of fellowship, the Holy Spirit fills us like a deep breath of fresh air. So I thought there's maybe something I could do with the whole idea that, we're not perfect people. We're not people who've got it all sorted out and come to this community as, perfect, shiny beings, but we're all marked and scarred and have questions and don't necessarily know that we fit in sometimes, but we do. Funnily enough.
That wasn't in the least bit trivial,
No.
Rachel. Being trivial is entirely my job and my role in this whole thing. I kind of, just a couple of things, and this would be a complete departure from almost anything we've talked about, but through Ephesians and elsewhere, Paul deals with this whole becoming one family thing with the idea of adoption, and many congregations will have people who have experienced adoption, either adopting or by being adopted. And it struck me, if it was relevant in a local community or in a local town, that it might be an opportunity to bring in one of the local adoption practitioners who's working with the agencies, who know something about it, or a family who knows something about it, maybe to talk the good publicity and whatever and partnership with the church, but also to talk about what that experience is. How do you build a family when someone's adopted? How does, it's like the prodigal son, how does the older brother who's always been there feel like, and the new usurper, how do you build those kind of connections? And is there any lesson we can learn from actual adoption in this idea of spiritual adoption? I don't know. There might be, but it might be worth a conversation if you knew someone who could find someone to try and think that through. because it's very easy to say let's all be together as one big family, but actually it takes a bit of work, and there are people who know about that stuff. The other kind of visual thing I had in mind, I was kind of taken by the end of that little mark cluster that we've got, where it says it went across to Gennesaret, where we're waiting for the pigs, aren't we? But we don't, it doesn't give us that. And everyone recognizes him. It's not clear why they recognize him. But that's an interesting question to explore. But it was the end. They laid the sick in the marketplaces, begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed, which is a little bit like the woman who pressed through the crowd and grabbed the fringe of his cloak. And I thought there might be mileage for some kind of prayer or activity where you got hold of a big fringed cloak of some sort, and then you could get people to come out and all hold around the edges of a fringed cloak and to pray together for healing of whatever it is that people might need healing, whilst holding the edge of a fringed cloak. Maybe that's kind of more artsy fartsy than I normally am, but there you go, I'm trying my best. I also came across a song which is kind of inspired by this word compassion. Jesus had compassion, and I came across this quite nice little song by Marty Haugen that I'll just play you a little bit of, because I thought it's something that's easily sung by a congregation, not one that I was familiar with. Right, so that carried on playing, and I wasn't expecting that to happen. I should have stopped it before I stopped the screen sharing, shouldn't I? Yeah, the word compassion comes right at the end in the 4th verse.
Yeah, that's nice.
They didn't actually sing that, but I thought it was quite a nice sort of summation of some of the things that we've talked about, plus fairly easy to sing. So yeah, we've got art, we've got music, we've got we've got actions we can take. We've got plenty of ideas for preaching. Has anyone got any anything that's start again? Anyone got anything they need to say before we finish? An urgent thought that has come to mind? No. Okay. In which case, I think Neil is going to lead us in prayer as we prepare this week for this task of bringing these passages alive for the congregations and contexts in which we will be preaching. Thank you, Neil.
So let's pray. And we read, as he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and he had compassion for them. So Lord, we pray for all who will be involved in bringing worship together, in breaking open your word, in preaching and in leading in any way, that you will be with us, and that we also might be people of compassion, and that we might find the food we need for our journeys in the power of your Spirit. Amen.
Amen.